Plato's Republic.
Yeah, sounds good.
This time, we're going to meet face-to-face with the infamous tyrant.
Yeah, we've already gone through this whole thing with Plato and his ideal city.
Right.
That battle between justice and injustice.
Mm-hmm.
But now the real question is the tyrant actually happy?
Yeah, I know.
Or is there something else going on?
That's kind of what I was thinking. Like, you always picture a tyrant, right?
Yeah.
As this, like, larger-than-life figure, like, totally drunk on power.
Right.
And maybe even, like, happy in this, like, ruthlessly effective kind of way.
Exactly. And that's where Plato kind of throws us for a loop.
Okay.
In Book 9, he basically comes out and says, the tyrant is the least happy of all people.
Really?
Yeah.
Less happy than somebody who's, like, facing injustice.
That's what Plato says.
Okay.
And the reason he gives is because the tyrant is a slave
To
what he calls lawless desires.
lawless desires, okay.
And he gets really specific here. He's talking about the kind of desires that most people only experience in their dreams.
Oh, okay.
The things that we kind of, we would never even admit to.
Right.
So we're talking, and he lists some of these in the text.
Okay.
Sleeping with your mother or with anyone else. Man, God, beast.
Wow.
Committing murder, like really hardcore stuff.
So how does somebody even get to that point?
Well,
I mean, do you just wake up one morning, you're like, I am now a tyrant?
That's what's so interesting is that Plato actually gives us like the origin story of the tyrant.
Okay.
So he says, imagine the son of a really permissive Democrat.
Okay.
So already used to having, very few boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
And then this young man falls in with what Plato calls drones. Drones. These are people who appeal to his baser instincts, right?
Yeah.
His thirst for immediate gratification.
So they're like enablers?
Exactly. Think about like the friend that's always like, come on, one more drink.
Right.
One more drink, even though you know you shouldn't.
Right.
They represent that voice inside all of us that's like, come on, indulge.
Yeah.
And with the tyrant, that voice becomes monstrously loud.
Okay.
Plato even uses this really vivid metaphor of a monstrous winged drone.
A monstrous winged drone.
Yeah.
Okay.
That gets implanted in the tyrant's soul.
Okay. But even if you have all of those desires, how does that make you unhappy? I mean, if anything, wouldn't it be more satisfying if you could fulfill all those desires?
See, and that's the thing. It's not really about the fulfilling. It's about the fact that these desires, they're not just fleeting.
Right.
They're insatiable. They're constant. This drone is always hungry.
Okay.
And so the tyrant is constantly scrambling to satisfy it.
Yeah.
And never quite getting there.
So it's less about the having and more about the constant wanting.
Exactly. And this is what traps the tyrant, right?
Okay.
Because they're always striving, they're always anxious,
Yeah.
they live in fear, and ultimately they're isolated.
Yeah.
Even though they might have all this outward power, right?
Right.
Inwardly, it's a mess.
But like if the tyrant is the one in charge, right?
Yeah.
Can't they like fulfill those desires whenever?
So this is interesting. Plato actually argues that the private tyrant, the one who's just struggling with this internally,
Okay.
is actually better off than the tyrant who's in a position of power.
How so?
Because the tyrant in power, Plato says, they live in constant fear of retribution.
Okay.
You remember that thought experiment from the text?
Refresh my memory.
Imagine a slave owner
Okay.
suddenly dropped on an island
Okay.
full of people who hate slavery.
Right.
That's the tyrant's life,
Okay.
always looking over their shoulder.
Okay, so they're in control, but they're also living in fear.
Exactly. They might have control over others,
Right.
but they have no control over themselves, and they're terrified of what might happen.
That's a scary combination.
Yeah.
Wow, yeah. So outward power doesn't necessarily equal inner peace.
Not at all.
So then how does Plato define happiness then?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. Because Plato, he goes deep on this whole idea of pleasure itself.
Okay.
He says that most of what we think of as pleasure is actually just the absence of pain.
So like when you're starving and you finally eat, that feeling is like a relief.
Exactly.
But I mean, is that the same thing as like the joy of listening to music?
Right, exactly. And Plato says, no, those are different. There's different types of pleasure out there.
Okay.
And he actually says there's 3 types of people, each driven by a different kind of pleasure. You've got your truth lovers,
Okay.
your honor lovers, and your profit lovers.
So the truth lovers, those are like the philosophers.
Bingo. They live for knowledge, those aha moments,
Mm.
always seeking, always questioning.
Yeah. Okay. Makes sense. And then I'm guessing the honor lovers, those are more like your soldiers, driven by glory and recognition.
You got it. Think courage, bravery, that thirst for winning, for being the best.
Right. Okay. And then lastly, you got your profit lovers. So those are the ones who are all about the material stuff, right? Wealth, possessions, the whole nine yards.
Exactly. Always chasing after more money, more stuff, more status.
Okay, so three very different paths.
Mm.
But each one thinks that their path is the best way, right? Like, obviously.
Of course. But here's the thing. Socrates argues that only one of these types has actually experienced all three.
Okay, let me guess. The philosophers.
Right again. Think about it. They've dabbled in the pleasures of honor, they've seen the allure of profit, but ultimately they found those things lacking.
Okay, so they've seen behind the curtain, tasted it all, and they're like, nah, this is where it's at.
Exactly. They've got that wisdom, that broader perspective. And that's why, for Plato, the truest form of happiness comes from a life ruled by reason.
Because you're not chasing after those fleeting pleasures, you're after something deeper.
Precisely. And it's this pursuit of truth, this dedication to knowledge and wisdom that leads to true, lasting fulfillment.
Which brings us back to that whole idea of justice as this, like, harmonious soul, right? It's all connected for Plato.
100%. A just life is a reasoned life, and a reasoned life is the happiest life. It's all intertwined.
And that's where his whole comparison of the king and the tyrant comes in, right?
Exactly. Remember, Socrates even tries to quantify it, saying that a true king, a philosopher king, lived something like 729 times more pleasantly than a tyrant.
729 times. Okay, so maybe he wasn't great at math, but I get the point. That's a huge difference.
It's about highlighting the gap in the quality of their happiness. The king, driven by reason, versus the tyrant, enslaved to those desires.
Right. Those monstrous winged drones are never satisfied. No matter how much power you gain, it's never enough.
Exactly. And that constant striving, that insatiable hunger, it leads to misery. And that's something that's still so relevant today, don't you think? I mean, we see it everywhere we look.
Totally. It's like this whole idea of the tyrant, those desires that consume us. It's not just some ancient Greek problem, it's a human problem.
Yeah, absolutely. That potential for tyranny, it exists within all of us. It's those desires that can pull us off course, lead us to chase after things that promise happiness, but leave us emptier than before.
So what's the solution? Are we all doomed to be ruled by our inner tyrants?
Well, Plato offers a glimmer of hope. Remember that whole idea of the ideal city existing in the heavens, that perfect pattern?
Yeah, like a blueprint for how things should be.
Exactly. And Plato suggests that even if we can't perfectly recreate that city here on Earth, we can still strive to build it within ourselves.
So instead of trying to create this perfect society out there, it's more about finding that inner balance, cultivating a just soul.
That's the idea. It's about recognizing those desires, those tyrannical impulses we all have, and choosing a different path, choosing to feed the philosopher within.
Okay, so which is it going to be? Are we going to keep feeding the beast, or are we going to try to nurture that philosopher inside us? It's definitely something to think about.
And it's not a one-time choice either.
Yeah.
Right? It's an ongoing process.
Right, right.
We're always going to be aware of those different parts of ourselves, those different desires.
Yeah.
And it's up to us to choose who we want to be every single day.
It's like you're saying it's about building that inner city brick by brick with every decision we make. And it's not about being perfect like those philosopher kings. It's about the striving.
Exactly. It's about the journey, the awareness, the constant seeking. And I think that's what's so amazing about Plato.
Yeah.
He's not giving us a set of rules or some predetermined fate. He's basically giving us an invitation to examine our lives, our values, our desires, and to really choose that path of the philosopher.
The path that leads to what he sees as true happiness.
Exactly.
It's been an interesting journey exploring this whole idea of the tyrant, both internally and, in the world around us.
It's a lot to unpack.
It really is. It feels like we've only just scratched the surface, to be honest.
Yeah, with Plato, there's always more to discover, more to think about. But hopefully this deep dive into Book 9 of the Republic has given you a new way to think about things.
Yeah.
About happiness, about power, about what it means to build that just city within ourselves.
It definitely has for me. So to everyone listening, here's something to think about. What does it mean for you to build that just city within?
Yeah, that's a good question.
What choices are you going to make today to nurture that inner philosopher and keep that monstrous winged drone at bay? Until next time, keep asking the big questions.